late at night in a research facility worth more than most small countries, where the sharpest minds in America had gathered to solve a problem no one could crack. A single equation glowed on a glass wall like an accusation. Billions of dollars, careers on the line, a company's survival hanging from one unresolved variable. Down the hall, a man named Theodore pushed a mop bucket across cold linoleum, invisible to everyone. He paused. He looked. 5 seconds. One motion, and nothing would ever be the same. Helios Dynamics occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Austin, Texas, a company that had bet its entire future on a single breakthrough. The premise was elegant. A proprietary energy optimization algorithm capable of reducing industrial power consumption by 40%. If it worked, the technology was worth well over $1 billion in licensing contracts already sitting in legal review. If it didn't work, those contracts dissolved, and so did Helios Dynamics. The board had given CEO Scarlett Monroe 3 months to deliver a working model. That deadline was now 12 hours away. Scarlett was 28 years old, which made her the youngest chief executive in Helios Dynamics history, and depending on who was speaking, either a visionary or an overreaching liability. She had graduated summa cum laude from MIT at 20, earned a dual doctorate in applied physics and electrical engineering by 24, and spent the following 4 years convincing investors, government agencies, and her own board that she could do what no one else had managed to do: commercialize a branch of energy mathematics that most of the academic world considered theoretically sound, but practically unreachable. She was not cold by nature. She had simply learned, through years of being the youngest and often the only woman in the room, that warmth was a currency she could not afford to spend carelessly, so she kept it locked away, and what people saw instead was precision, efficiency, a controlled stillness that some mistook for arrogance. Theodore Marsh was 34 years old. He wore a gray uniform with his first name stitched above the left breast pocket, drove a 12-year-old pickup truck to work every night at 9, and clocked out at 5 in the morning to get home before his daughter woke up. She had her mother's eyes and her father's quietness, and she liked to draw pictures of horses on the backs of grocery receipts. Theodore kept every single one of them folded in his wallet. He had held the janitor position at Helios Dynamics for 14 months. Nobody on the science floor knew his last name. The researchers who worked late nights acknowledged him the way people acknowledge weather, an ambient presence that required no particular response. He returned that indifference without bitterness. He mopped floors. He emptied waste baskets. He replenished paper towels in the restrooms and made sure the glass in the conference room doors was always clean. He did his job quietly, and then he went home to his daughter. There was nothing about Theodore's posture or expression that invited questions. He moved through the building with the practiced efficiency of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that invisibility was not a loss but a choice. What no one at Helios Dynamics knew was that Theodore had once been something else entirely. The science team occupying the 4th floor had been assembled from the best research institutions in the country. Dr. Madia's 9. Christopher Vane led the group, a 47-year-old theoretical physicist from Stanford with 17 published papers, 2 industry awards, and the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in public. Beneath him, a rotating cast of postdoctoral researchers and senior engineers had spent 92 days attacking the optimization equation from every angle they could conceive. They had tried adaptive modeling. They had tried dimensional reduction. They had tried 3 separate algorithmic frameworks pulled from aerospace, computational biology, and financial modeling. Every approach converged on the same problem: a nonlinear coupling term in the central equation that refused to yield a stable solution. It sat there like a locked door, and nobody could find the key. The pressure had been building for weeks, but it reached a new pitch on the evening of the final deadline. Scarlett had called an emergency meeting at 9 o'clock. She stood at the head of the conference table with a calm that everyone in the room recognized as the thin crust over something volcanic, and she asked a simple question: "Where are we?" Christopher delivered the answer in the tone of a man performing a post-mortem. The coupling term, he explained, was exhibiting behavior inconsistent with the model's foundational assumptions. They needed more time. 2 weeks, minimum. Possibly a month. The algorithm, as currently structured, could not be stabilized before morning. Scarlett did not raise her voice. She said, "We don't have 2 weeks. Then she ended the meeting. In the hallway outside the conference room, Christopher lingered with two of his junior researchers, and his voice carried farther than he intended. "This isn't a problem for ordinary people," he said, with the particular dismissiveness of someone who had just been embarrassed and needed to redirect. "There are maybe 6 people on Earth who could see a path through that equation, and none of them are in this building tonight." Theodore was mopping the floor 20 feet away. He had his back turned, head down, moving the mop in long, even strokes. His cart's wheel had a slight squeak that Christopher had stopped noticing weeks ago. Theodore did not turn around when he heard the comment. He did not react visibly at all, but his hand slowed on the mop handle, just slightly, and after a moment, he shifted his angle so that he could see the glass wall of the conference room from the corner of his eye. The equation was still on the board. 16 lines. A cascade of variables and operators that most people would need 20 minutes just to parse. Theodore parsed it in approximately 8 seconds, and what he saw made his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. He pushed the cart forward. He kept walking. He went down the hall and did not look back. The apartment Theodore shared with Chloe was on the 3rd floor of a brick building in East Austin, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen with a window that caught the morning light just right. Chloe called it their castle. Theodore called it home. On the rare nights he got back early enough, he would stand in her doorway for a moment after she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, and feel something that had no clean name, gratitude, and grief fused together into a single quiet ache. Her mother, Diane, had died 3 years ago. A car accident on a Sunday morning in November, the kind of random, senseless event that rewrites everything that comes after it. Theodore had been at a conference in Boston when it happened, a mathematics conference, the kind where young researchers presented early-stage work and older researchers decided whose careers were worth cultivating. He had been presenting his own paper, a foundational theoretical framework for energy state optimization in nonlinear coupled systems. Work he had spent 4 years developing, work that had attracted serious attention from 2 major research institutions and an energy conglomerate with deep pockets. He had flown home to a hospital and then to a funeral, and he had never gone back to that world. The formal version of what happened next was uncomplicated. Theodore Marsh withdrew from his doctoral program at the University of Texas at 29 years old and did not return. The actual version was more complicated. In the months after Diane's death, while he was barely functional, his research had been absorbed quietly, methodically, without his knowledge or consent, into the foundational documents of a project being developed by a colleague he had trusted. The attribution was removed. The theoretical backbone Theodore had constructed over 4 years appeared in published form, under a different name, reformulated just enough to complicate any legal challenge. By the time Theodore understood what had happened, the cost of fighting it financially, emotionally, with a 3-year-old daughter who needed a present father was higher than he could afford to pay. So he walked away. He took a series of jobs that kept him physically occupied and mentally quiet. Security guard, warehouse worker, janitor. He was good at all of them, and none of them asked anything of the part of his brain he had decided to lock away. He paid his bills, coached Chloe's soccer team on Saturday mornings, and read advanced topology textbooks at the kitchen table after she went to sleep, the same way other men might watch television. Not to go anywhere. Just to keep the lights on in a room he no longer planned to enter. It was Chloe, 2 weeks earlier, who had accidentally handed him the key. She had been drawing a horse at the kitchen table, and she had looked up at him with complete seriousness and asked, "Dad, why do you always start in the middle?" He had been helping her with a puzzle. She had watched him skip to the centerpieces instead of building the border first. It was a small observation, the kind a 6-year-old makes without knowing what she's said. Theodore had laughed, helped her finish the puzzle, and put her to bed. But the question had lodged somewhere in his thinking, and it was still there 3 hours later when he walked into the Helios Dynamics building and began his shift. By 2 in the morning, the 4th floor had emptied except for one room. The simulation lab at the end of the east corridor still had its lights on. And through the glass Theodore could see Marcus Webb, the team's senior computational engineer, alone at a workstation, running the same verification loop for what appeared to be the 4th or 5th time. The result was the same each time. Marcus would lean back, drag a hand across his face, and start again. The main conference room, which Theodore had skipped earlier in the evening, still had the equation on the board. The room was empty now. Someone had left a half-full coffee cup on the table and a legal pad covered in margin notes, all of them crossed out. Theodore pushed his cart to the doorway. He looked at the equation. The error was not subtle, exactly, but it was the kind of error you could only see if you approached the problem from a specific direction. One that the team had clearly never tried, because it ran counter to the dominant methodology in the field. They were treating the coupling term as a boundary condition, when it was, in fact, a dynamic input. The entire system had been structured around a false assumption that had been baked into the foundational literature for so long that questioning it had stopped feeling like an option. Theodore had identified this class of error before. He had spent 4 years building a framework specifically designed to avoid it. He knew, within about 30 seconds of re-examining the board, exactly what the correction required. He also knew it was not his problem. He pulled a cloth from the cart and began wiping down the conference table. He worked from one end to the other, moving the legal pad, repositioning the coffee cup. He did not look at the board again. He was almost to the door when Chloe's question surfaced without warning in the back of his mind, not as a thought, but as a sound. Her voice in the kitchen 2 weeks ago, completely certain. "Why do you always start in the middle?" He stopped. He stood at the doorway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he turned around, walked to the equipment tray near the wall, and picked up a whiteboard marker that someone had left uncapped. He stood in front of the board for exactly 5 seconds. He made one modification, a single variable reclassification in the coupling term that reframed the entire structure of the problem. 4 characters, a subscript change and a new boundary notation. Anyone who knew what they were looking at would understand immediately. Anyone who didn't would see nothing but a small mark near the bottom of a crowded equation. Theodore capped the marker, set it back on the tray, and pushed his cart out of the room. He was 3 floors down, reloading paper towels in the second-floor men's room, when Marcus Webb walked back into the conference room and stopped completely still. Marcus had come back for his jacket. He noticed the change before he reached the table. The equation was familiar enough by now that any variation registered immediately. The way a misplaced word registers in a sentence, you've read 100 times. He set down his jacket. He stepped closer. He read the modification twice, then looked away and looked back at it. The way you do when you're not sure you're seeing what you think you're seeing. He picked up a marker and began checking the logic. It took him 11 minutes. He worked through 3 pages of the legal pad, and by the end of it he was standing very still, holding the marker at his side, staring at a result that should not have been possible at this stage of the night. The modification didn't just stabilize the coupling term. It dissolved the entire nonlinear barrier by recontextualizing the variable in a way that made the original constraint obsolete. The equation, which had resisted every effort for 3 months, now resolved cleanly to a deterministic solution. Marcus checked it again. Then he picked up his phone and called Christopher. Christopher arrived 17 minutes later, still in his overcoat, and the conversation that followed was conducted almost entirely in silence. He checked Marcus's work. He checked it again. He stood with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable for a long moment, and then he went to the simulation terminal and ran the model. The model ran clean. He ran it again with a different data set. Clean again. He ran it a 3rd time with the most extreme parameters they had tested during the original trial phase, the parameters that had previously caused catastrophic instability within the first few computational cycles. The simulation completed with a stability margin of 96%. Christopher said nothing for a long time. Then he turned and looked at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, the standard security camera that recorded all work on the 4th floor as part of the company's intellectual property protocol. He looked at it the way a person looks at a witness they hadn't noticed until it was too late. By 3 in the morning, Scarlett was in the building. She had not been asleep. She reviewed the simulation results herself, asked Marcus 4 questions in quick succession, and then stood at the conference room board for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. The modification was spare, almost insultingly simple, given the scale of the problem it resolved. That was what made it convincing. There was no performance in it. Whoever had made that change had not been trying to impress anyone. They had simply seen something and corrected it. She asked Marcus to pull the security footage. The timestamp showed 9 minutes after 2 in the morning. A janitor's cart appeared in the frame at the doorway. The figure pushed it into the room, moved to the table, wiped it down. Then he paused, walked to the marker tray, picked up a marker, and stood at the board for 5 seconds. The modification was made in a single, economical motion. The marker was capped and replaced. The figure left the room. Scarlett watched the clip 3 times. Then she asked Marcus for the employee's name. Theodore was informed the following morning, via a message from building administration, that his presence was requested on the 4th floor, at 10 o'clock. The phrasing was neutral enough that it carried no particular alarm. He arrived in his gray uniform, 5 minutes early, and was shown into a small meeting room he had cleaned many times. Scarlett was already there, along with Christopher and a woman named Patricia from the company's legal team. Theodore sat down across from them. He folded his hands on the table. Christopher opened with the question directly. Had Theodore altered the equation on the main conference room board the previous night? Theodore said yes. The room adjusted slightly. Christopher exchanged a glance with Patricia. Scarlett asked Theodore to explain his reasoning. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the coupling term was misclassified. Treating it as a fixed boundary condition was